Hi everyone, it's Ren here. I hope you're doing well. And in this video, I'm going to be talking about the concepts of will in Schopenhauer and in Nietzsche. And just to give you a quick snippet into what my arguments will be about, it will basically be about this idea that what distinguishes Schopenhauer's concept of will from Nietzsche's concept of will is that in Schopenhauer, the concept of will corresponds to the affirmation of a negativity, so it's a negation, whereas in Nietzsche, the concept of will, I think, corresponds to an affirmation of life, a positivity. So Schopenhauer, negativity, Nietzsche, positivity. Now, this is the premise of my argument. Now, let's look into this question in a little more detail. So, first of all, what is will? What is will? It's a fair question to ask. Not everybody might be comfortable or might be familiar with this concept. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that there are philosophers, professional philosophers included, that do not take the concept of will too seriously because of its vagueness, if you like. It's very hard to conceptualize will. But I think it's fair to say that will really was born as a concept in philosophy with the work of Schopenhauer. And so it's actually a fairly recent concept, if you like. It's less than 200 years old, when you keep in mind that some philosophers were active, like Thales was active 600 BC or something. You can imagine that will is a fairly modern concept, and it is a concept that perhaps constitutes Schopenhauer's greatest presence to the philosophical discipline and the seed of his influence. So why did Schopenhauer come up with this concept? Well, I think that Schopenhauer was, originally he was trained as a Kantian. Okay, so he was a neo-Kantian or a Kantian who had a form of dissatisfaction with Kantianism. And I think, and again, this is more like an introductory video, so I'll try to keep it simple and synthetic. Keep in mind that this is also my interpretation. It might not be the interpretation of everyone. But Schopenhauer was frustrated with Kantianism because he was thinking, okay, Kantianism, it explains human rationality, it explains human morality, it explains human judgments, it explains human perception of beauty, it explains a lot of things about the metaphysical world, and it explains a lot of things about how we perceive the world and how we make sense of the world and how we reason our way through the world, and therefore, as a consequence, how we also pursue the good in practice through our morality. And so when Kant created his system, it was a watershed. It's like one of the most influential events in the whole history of philosophy. It's very important to keep in mind. It's hard to even get a sense of how influential Kant's work was, because with it you almost could get a sense that you could explain just anything. And Schopenhauer was frustrated because he saw something that was missing. And what did he feel was missing, broadly speaking? Broadly speaking, what Schopenhauer thought was missing was just the whole dimension of instincts in a human being. So that unlike what Kant would have us believe, that we're just rational creatures that refer to the categories of thought and that relate to the world in that way. In fact, human beings are not completely rational creatures. There's a very irrational part to what we do. But at the same time, it's hard to quite measure it in terms of purely instinct, animal instinct. It seems like there's something more to human being than just instinct, and that what we do when it is irrational cannot easily be captured and summarized as just being instinct, like the instinct of an animal. there seems to be something that is qualitative about it, but not categorized and categorizable as the domain of the rational, like in Kant. So nowadays, and again, this testifies to Schopenhauer's immense influence, we tend to understand this as the domain of the unconscious. Unconscious processes that psychoanalysis and psychology discuss. And Carl Jung, was interested in that too. I mean, they are essentially the further germination of what initially came to be defined as will in Schopenhauer. And you can see how amazingly influential that was, because to us nowadays we say, oh yeah, like subconsciously or unconsciously. Can you imagine that philosophers and people, I assume, were not discussing this at all in their work? They were just assuming that we were like essences or rational creatures that just didn't have those unconscious processes that were influencing our life, our decisions. They're influencing our rational decision making also. They add something else, and that's will in Schopenhauer's sense. But what Schopenhauer found was that will is extremely difficult to categorize. It's extremely difficult to define. It seems to be this force that's within us, and that tends to want to assert itself despite the better advice of human reason. And so it seems that we have a tendency, when we are dominated by will, to indeed want to dominate another human being. We want to master other beings. We want to assert all those impulses that we do not want to allow ourselves to believe. The domination of another, the destruction. It's oriented towards destruction and disorder. Will, if you like, it's almost like the symmetrical other side of ordered human rationality. And Schopenhauer said that's also an expression of humanity. And he called this book The World as Will and Representation, because he said the world for a human being is, and for him, will went beyond human being. It expresses itself in all different species, but in human being it took that form. He said, well, the way in which human being relates to the world is by means of representation, perception and representation of what we perceive in a rational manner. We can have together a conversation about the personality traits of a given person, so we're representing them rationally. But the world is also will, and it's not opposed. There are like two different angles towards the world, and we can either look at the world as the structural, ordered universe, or as the unstructured, disordered universe. And they come together, and in human being they can be seen, if we wanted to use a more up-to-date vocabulary, in our conscious processes and on our unconscious processes. We cannot really say, oh, I'm Ren, part of me is conscious, part of me is unconscious. That's not how it works, really. It's like the conscious and the unconscious are constantly woven into one another, right? Into the person that makes me, and into what I say, and into what I think, and into what I dream, and etc., etc. And that's the world as will and representation, broadly speaking, in Schopenhauer. But what Schopenhauer said was that we have, if we want to be happy, because Schopenhauer, despite his reputation as a pessimist, he was fundamentally interested in how to make human being as happy as possible, how for human being to be as happy as possible, that being the good. And so he was interested in this question from the angle of his new categorization of will and, let's say, reason, for lack of a better word. And what he was saying was that will is disordered and it's chaos. And therefore, because it cannot be subjected to any laws, and even nowadays, the unconscious remains a notoriously opaque domain, precisely because it cannot be accessed consciously by ourselves. He said, it cannot be mastered by definition. It is what brings disorder in our lives. It is what makes us do things that we shouldn't do, because we cannot repress it completely. And even the repression of it is stressful, but nevertheless, we should try to repress it as much as possible. We should try to rid ourselves of our will. We can never quite do it, but we should try to make it as small as possible in our lives, because that's how we will attain peace, a sort of harmony Because will is oriented toward disharmony, the only way to attain harmony for Schopenhauer is through the taming and the weakening of will. And for that, he was influenced by the Eastern religions, Buddhism especially, and this idea that like a Buddhist ascetic would lead a life in which they would sort of deprive themselves of their own will to live in as close as possible to a state of inner quietude that is very, very linked to their ascetic life, depriving themselves of the will to do things, to eat things, to manifest will in many ways. And for Schopenhauer, he's seen as a pessimist and a negative interpreter of will because for him, will is not a good thing. It is anathema to human flourishing and happiness. It needs to be tamed. It needs to be mastered. And the less will you have, the more you've sort of like erased will from your being, the more you will be at peace within yourself, closer to nirvana, right? It's a very controversial idea because it seems like what he's suggesting is that we go against our natural drives, against our natural tendencies towards expressing our will, our volition, the will to do things. So why, like, it's almost like as if the wise, happy, content man who has attained nirvana is kind of, you picture him as being still and meditating, and he's meditating because he doesn't want to have the specter of will coming to the foreground again. Well, that's Schopenhauer, negative conception of will. Nietzsche comes, and what does Nietzsche do? Well, Nietzsche realizes straight away that Schopenhauer was right about will in at least a formal sense. Nietzsche spends a lot of time in his work criticizing Kant, and he sees limitations in Kant's system, which was the dominant system at the time. You need to keep this in mind. A dominant system, you could say that Hegel was not the dominant system, but the thing is, like, even Hegel to some extent is greatly influenced by Kant. Anyway, so Nietzsche criticizes Kant and sees also the existence of will that Schopenhauer saw, and this is why Nietzsche, for a great part of his life, considered himself very openly to be a disciple of Schopenhauer. All right, he saw that Schopenhauer saw something about the human condition and the nature of the world that other people didn't see. He was willing to face the chaos and the arbitrariness of will. But Nietzsche eventually came to realize, at least in his opinion, that, it was absurd on Schopenhauer's part to say that humans should erase will from... Well, I mean, I guess it was absurd that they should try to erase will from their lives, from their being. If will is a natural thing for us to live, to have, to express, surely it should not be nurtured. And a lot of Nietzsche's philosophy, as you know, is a defense of life. He always says, I'm a philosopher of life. He defends beauty, he defends the arts, what he sees as the arts. He's on the side of life, he doesn't care very much for metaphysical systems. What he cares about is here and now, and how human being can be not necessarily as happy as possible, because for Nietzsche, the fact that there is will to be taken into account suggests, and in a sense, he agrees with Schopenhauer. He says, because there's will and there's disorder, this idea that we can attain like this ordered harmony that will make us content and happy and should be the aim of morality is impossible. It's mistaken, and so he takes a stance against the Kantian morality, which in many ways is very close in its being transcendental to the Christian morality, which Nietzsche so abhorred, and we know that. And so Nietzsche said, we can have an ethical system, but it should not be predicated upon the aim for ordered harmony and happiness, because if we do that, we end up with the absurd conclusions of Schopenhauer that we should deprive ourselves of what is most natural to ourselves, which is will. And so what did Nietzsche do? He said, well, let's take this aim of morality as we typically understand it, but go further than Schopenhauer. In addition to pointing out that there is such a thing as will, let's also point out that the utmost human flourishing is not happiness, it's not harmony, it is the affirmation of power. And when Nietzsche talks about the affirmation of power, he means that for a human being to express its innermost nature, it needs to express its health. There's nothing better and more beautiful and also more moral in many ways. In Nietzsche, the aesthetics and the moral questions are very linked. He talks about a great life as a life of style. So there is an aesthetic dimension, but for him it's an eminently moral life in his own understanding. He says, if you're a human being, your aim should be to attain the best possible version of yourself. But the best possible version of yourself is not necessarily the most quiet, content, harmonious version of yourself. No, it should be pushing yourself as much as possible. And if it means that you have to crush other people on your way to greatness, then you should do it, because these people are weak. Sometimes they're even complacent and basking in their weakness, and they're not going to bring you anywhere. So what you should really try to do is assert yourself, and if it should mean crushing other people, well, you crush them, because that's what you must do. And in that way, he was celebrating will. He was saying will is far from being something that we need to neuter. Will is a positivity, and that's back to the abstract I gave you at the very start. Will is a positivity. Will is something that a human being is eminently capable of expressing to such an extent that it can create beauty in the world. It can create the joy associated with having the power of asserting yourself, the power of having a beautiful life, a grand style, as he was saying. And for Nietzsche, that's perfectly compatible with a morality that sees as its purpose not the good, right? Not the good, but the most perfect health. And for him, health has it has a metaphorical dimension. It means that human being is capable of having a potential of doing great things, beautiful things, great things. That includes art, also great conquest, anything that has the sound of the sublime. What human being can achieve that is sublime, that brings it closer to the gods, if you like, is what Nietzsche thinks is the aim of morality. And will, expressing itself in the most powerful people, the people that are the most susceptible of achieving great things, should be left unhindered. It should express itself completely, because that will bring us to the greatest heights. And if it crushes people that are too weak to resist it, or to deal with it, or to affirm their own will, so be it. That is the law of will, if you like, even if it is a lawless force in many ways. But that's Nietzsche's perspective. So you can see how it is very controversial, but at the same time extremely original and exciting. There's something exciting about the fact that someone could see that, in human nature, and take a stance that originally is very close to Schopenhauer's conception of will, but instead of being a negativity, it is a positivity. All right, guys, let me know what you think, and if you found this useful, let me know in the comments, and I hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye.